The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar tonight, Impaired Driving Healing After the Death of a Child. Our webinar tonight is brought to you by the Compassionate Friends and Open to Hope, and our special guest tonight is Carl McDonald, the National Law Enforcement Initiatives Manager for MAD. These webinars are brought to you in partnership with Open to Hope and the Compassionate Friends because we want to bring you good grief information and bring you guests who have knowledge in very specific areas of grief. And I think tonight we have a very special guest, and we're going to have a great program. I'm Alan Pedersen, the Executive Director of the Compassionate Friends, and my co-hosts tonight are from Open to Hope, Dr. Heidi Horsley and Dr. Gloria Horsley. Ladies, welcome to the webinar tonight. I think we're going to have a good one.
Hey, Alan, this is Gloria. I think so too, and we love the guest we're having on today. We've known him for years from the Compassionate Friends. He's a wonderful person, and Heidi and I just presented at MAD with him. He's a great guy.
Yes, Alan, this is Heidi, and we're excited to be here. And like my mom said, we met Carl McDonald over 10 years ago at the Compassionate Friends, and I'm interested to hear about his journey and how he found hope after the loss of his daughter. This should be a really great webinar.
Well, great. Gloria, as usual, we're going to kind of let you take the lead, and you're going to introduce Carl, and he has his own story to tell, which I think people are going to find interesting. I know we're going to have a lot of questions tonight from those listeners and from our Facebook pages. So, Gloria, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Well, Carl, welcome to this webinar. We're excited to have you on. Why don't we start with you telling us your story?
Well, thank you, Gloria. As explained, my name is Carl McDonald, and my story's kind of large, so I'll try to select out parts of it. I am a career law enforcement officer who is currently retired, but in 1998, I was a division supervisor for the Wyoming State Patrol in Rawlins, Wyoming. In 1998, on January 1, my daughter was killed in a drunk driving collision. And there were certain aspects of that collision that kind of put me into this very unique position because of what I did for a living and the circumstances of the crash. Now, the offender in the crash, unfortunately, was my ex-wife. We were divorced because of a drinking issue in the marriage, and I was concerned about the safety of my daughter. In the process of a divorce, I had sought custody successfully of my daughter, but my ex-wife still had visitation rights. Long story short, on January 1st, during a holiday visit, she was driving with my daughter in the car and rear-ended a tractor trailer on Interstate 80 with a very high blood alcohol content of 0.22. And my daughter was killed at the scene of that crash. My daughter was placed in the front seat of the car as a passenger and did not survive the crash. She was 5 years old.
Wow. Oh, Carl, so sorry.
Wow.
Well, I know you've learned a lot from this event and been able to honor Carly and her name with all the great work you've done. Let's go to the next slide and talk about the death of a child in the collision, because I know a lot of you are, what's happened to you will come up. So why don't you go ahead and start with that?
Well, I think that certainly amongst your listeners and participants in this webinar that there's many bereaved parents, and bereaved parents in a short, direct sense they've come to know intimately the impact of the death of a child and what it implies in their lives. This is the part of the important work of the Compassionate Friends and Open to Hope. And this has certainly been a huge part of my life, beginning that night on January 1st. It's the death of a child, and then this other dynamic that I was experiencing, and that those, unfortunately, that too often experience this as parents, in terms of a preventable criminal act, is has its own special set of cruelties. In general, the death of a child in the life of a parent is an unnatural event, and it defies all of our thinking. Healthy parenthood is anchored in the idea that we will outlive our children, and because of that, it's conditional. We would fearlessly protect our children given the choice, assuming that they will outlive us. And part of our mission is to make sure that that takes place, even to the point of sacrifice. You could ask an awful lot of parents and get the same answer, that they would trade places with their children, given the chance that the child would survive.
Wow.
Whatever befalls them, as we all know. And I think this whole dynamic of sudden death is hard on everyone. It's difficult to compare. It's probably not a good idea to compare, but there's certain dynamics about the death of a child in a crime-related activity that is so preventable as drunk driving. And as in the death of any child, all kinds of things start taking place. Helplessness rules. Realization is slow in coming. There's all kinds of things that are going on, certainly that I experienced and that all parents experience. Denial can be a very strong part of this. In my life, I had a couple of characteristics that right after my daughter was killed, and for a very long time ever since. And as a matter of fact, 2 years, I would not close the front drapes of my picture window at my house. Now that window faced out onto the street, and normally those drapes would be drawn because it ensures a little bit of privacy in the home, except for, in my case, when I last saw my daughter, she was walking, I was looking at her through that window when she walked down the sidewalk and got into the vehicle when my ex-wife came to pick her up. And I had this belief that I could not close that curtain, for instance, because I wanted to see her come back up that same sidewalk.
Wow. Yeah.
As just an example of a small amount of denial that's involved in that lasted for 2 years.
Wow. Yeah. It's as you said, a natural event, and it takes a long journey. We've got a question here from somebody named Jane, and she said, I'm very moved by your story. I've also lost a child in a crash. I was wondering how this impacted you as a highway patrolman.
Well, that was the most significant thing. I think to start with and answer that question, and that's a really good one, because I felt that I realized that I was in a unique position immediately. One of my colleagues told me one day that working in the arena of traffic safety, and working the way I did, the way they do, with a lot of public safety education and all these other things that we were definitely involved in, as a career, that person, and it was true for me as well, said that somehow we think that we've inoculated ourselves against this kind of a threat, and it's that which happens to others that we're trying to fix, but when it happens to us, that just kind of adds to the shock. One of the things that I did early on, very early on, because I had a kind of an energy involved that I wanted to do something, is I sat down and I wrote a public service announcement and contacted a producer, and we ended up taping that public service announcement, and it was a very quick 30-second thing that would run on the air, but it involved my presence on the screen in uniform talking about the death of my daughter.
Wow.
And how if you think this can't happen to you, it happened to me, kind of thing. That was a very successful little project, and the producer of the video actually approached me at the conclusion of the taping of the public service announcement and suggested that she wanted to do a documentary about this. And we did a 20-minute documentary that got nationwide exposure. And long story short there, that's what kind of brought me onto the national stage. Got me familiar with the unfortunately small world of highway safety professionals in the country at the national level, and then ultimately brought me into circles that exposed me to contacts here at Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
So Carl, we have another question. It says, what happened to your ex-wife? The drunk driver that killed my girls received 18 years in prison, which I understand is more than most.
Wow. That's very accurate. To say that 18 years in prison is more than most.
Wow.
The penalties for this are state specific, obviously, and it is culturally specific. So, in a short version of that, what I'm trying to say is it's difficult to get a large prison sentence for someone who's killed another person in certain areas of the country, and Wyoming is certainly one of those. I had to have a conversation with my family and explain that my ex-wife, she did survive the crash, that she may end up with 5 years of probation. However, I had a very aggressive prosecutor working as hard as he could, and he went after very, very hard, recommended 12 to 18 years prison time on a guilty plea. And it was an open-ended guilty plea where the judge would hear victim statements and testimony and then make his decision on plea sentencing. And the judge sentenced her for 2 to 5 years. And she ultimately did 18 months in prison and then was released.
So she's been released?
Oh, yes.
Was that disappointing to you? How did you respond to that? Because we have a question here. She says, or he says, it doesn't have a name on it, the driver was killed in the same accident that my child was killed in. I frankly envy people who have someone that they can take to court.
I understand that. I do, and I think that makes perfect sense. That comes with its own set of worries. However, for instance, we talk in media circles all the time about closure, and boy, I particularly dislike that word. I think it's a media term. Closure means when the case is all settled and someone is sentenced, that the families really don't get closure. I think the media does. They get to fold their tripods, put their cameras away, and leave. That's their closure.
They actually do get closure. They pack up.
Yeah. And in sentencing for this, it was very disappointing to hear this 2 to 5 sentence, but I was prepared for that because of what I did for a living, and it didn't matter if it was 12 to 18 or 2 to 5. It was what it was, and I knew by then that it was time for me to, having accomplished the duty to see this put through the criminal court system, to then take a break and work on me. It was a very trying experience, extremely trying experience personally.
Well,
Carl,
Carl,
I'm getting some questions here on Facebook that kind of are along the same lines, and I think it's what you're going to address on this slide here about the criminal justice system. But I've got a couple of people who are asking specifically, how do you work on your grief when you're involved in the criminal justice system, and how do you deal with the frustration of feeling re-victimized when you go to court and there's delays, or it feels like that the courts, are concerned more about the rights of the perpetrator, is the exact phrasing in the question here. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely, and I think that's a characteristic of our criminal justice system, and it's not helped by current media practice or tradition of media practice, where they talk about the case in terms of the perpetrator's name. They don't talk about the case in terms of the victim's name. In my situation, my daughter's name is Carly, and it was not the Carly McDonald case or the Carly McDonald verdict. It was the Susan McDonald case or the Susan McDonald verdict, because she was the perpetrator. And so even my daughter's name is left out of it in that sense. Again, to my experience, one of the things that I had to endure was a preliminary hearing, which is this is a case where blood was drawn. My ex-wife admitted to drinking. Blood was drawn. Tests were done. The result was back, and she was being charged with the murder of a person under the influence of alcohol. It was very clear-cut, and I had to endure a preliminary hearing where all the evidence was going to come out in terms of autopsy, photographs of the autopsy, and endure this fairly early on in the process, so that a very low-level court judge could review this and say there's probable cause to send her to the higher court on this felony charge.
Wow, I just don't think people realize what people go through. I mean, it's incredible. Carl, can you do one thing for us right now and just give us quickly on these bullet points right here, your idea on what you were thinking when you gave us those Shattered Forever, the criminal. Just give us a quick little one-liner on each of those, and let's move on to the next slide.
Sure. I think that one of the problems that comes up, and we certainly deal with that a lot at Mothers Against Drunk Driving, is this. First off, you have this terrible loss of a child, and then you're thrust into the criminal justice system, which is a foreign environment for anyone who's unfamiliar with it. And then once that maze is negotiated in the criminal justice system, many people are left with enduring the ordeal in civil court process as well, which can be drawn out for many years. And each hearing and deposition and other event that takes place involving that just draws it out more and more. And then finally, through this whole process, I think it's very commonly stated by people who have lost a child under any circumstances that once they have gone through this crucible, that they are not the same person that they were going in. Mm-hmm. That certainly was true in my case. And just to summarize, the reason why I put that bullet in there is there's more that I could say on that, but it even goes so far in some as personality changes, certain dramatic lifestyle changes, etc. We're not the same.
Can I give you a question here because it kind of leads into this. It says, Carl, I'm so angry that my son was murdered by a drunk driver, and I can't seem to get past this anger. And I know that a lot of people are not the same person, and I know that anger is a legitimate and pretty common emotion after this kind of thing. So I was wondering what you could say to Sheila about that. She can't get past her anger.
Yeah, I obviously in what we do, and that's all inclusive of this audience, and moderators, is we encounter this a lot. In the strongest terms, I would certainly urge Sheila to really work on that hard, because Sheila needs to separate her life from that of the offender, and as quickly and as thoroughly, as strongly as possible. That's that offender's business and not Sheila's business. And to live one's life with the anger and betrayal of an offender as an overpowering emotion day to day is going to hurt Sheila. It's not going to hurt the offender at all.
Right. So Carl, what did you do to work through your anger? Because you've come a long way since I first met you.
And I think you've got some things on your next slide that will work into that.
Yeah. Surviving is not the easiest thing, and we all have to find and pick our way through. First, I would say, please don't give up. Very early on, the night of the crash, I had an experience with an old partner of mine. He drove me to the scene of the crash because I wanted to see what I could see. I wanted to find out what I could find out. I needed answers, and I have requested him to take me to the scene. Now, this is pretty much a mile marker on Interstate 80. It's an entrance ramp, and we were getting out of his car. He's a police officer. We're getting out of his car on the roadside, and I looked at him and I said, Richard, you don't have to watch me out of the corner of your eye. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, I'm not going to jump in front of the truck.
Wow.
And he said, what are you talking about? And I told him that if there's one place in the world that I thought I could follow my daughter in death, would be right there.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so don't give up. Number one, early on, don't give up. Breathing.
Carl, I just want to say to people, wanting to join your child is normal. Feeling that you would like, to join them where they are, but having a plan or, having the idea that you're going to do something about it is not normal.
Right. That's true. That's true. And I've certainly encountered a number of people in the same position, and it's fairly common. So it's very, very normal. So as I learned, breathing is an achievement. Getting up in the morning and standing on your feet is a victory. And putting one foot in front of the other and just starting to walk.
Here.
You need to just work on that as this is a victory. This is me, and I'm doing this. After moving through the significant portion of the criminal process, I knew that I wasn't healthy, and I had to take a very good pause and just lean into my grief. Once my duties were over with, the funeral, the eulogy, the criminal, the this, the that, and all these things that came up, once all those hurdles were overcome, then it was time for me. And I took some time to get away and lean into my grief. In my mind, it is a pay me now or pay me later proposition, because if we don't take time for that, then we will pay a cost for that. It has to be done. It's good hard work, and that's a lot of what the Compassionate Friends does. It is a lot of what Open to Hope is all about. And this is the hard work. This is where the big hard work takes place. Whether it's research and reading, going to therapy, going to groups and getting together with groups like Compassionate Friends to find that you are, number one, you are not alone, but you'll see your future there, where people have survived this, and they're several years down the road, and they can help folks in this walk.
You know, that brings me back to thinking about, we've done a couple of radio shows with Candy Leitner, who started Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and she started it right away after Carly, was her daughter's name Carly? Yeah. After her daughter died. And she said that she was with the Congress and advocating and lobbying for 3 years, and she said after 3 years I'd have to go home and do the work of grief. I hadn't done it.
Yeah.
So, and
that's a very good example.
Because everybody else had moved on. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have people around there doing that with me. Alan, I wondered if you could log in on this, because you know, you're head of Compassionate Friends, about the chapters and what you see as far as helping people.
Well, yeah, you know, we find a lot. We have a lot of families, obviously, who've had death from an impaired driver. And what I like about this webinar tonight, Carl, is there are some specific and unique things about this type of loss. And I think the Compassionate Friends is great for working on your grief. And what I love about what you're doing in MAD is that you're also helping these families with negotiating the criminal justice system and in the court system. And I think what you said was validation here. This last thing that you were talking about is, when you're involved in this type of a loss, you may not be able to focus on your grief like others may be able to do when you're caught up in the justice system and in the court system. And I think that's what our people are asking here. And that's okay, I think, is what you're saying, is that you may have to work on the justice side of things a little bit before you can focus on your grief. But at some point, you do have to give it that attention. And I think a lot of people hearing that is a validation for them, because they feel so caught up in the legal system and making sure that, you know, that part gets taken care of. So I think you gave a lot of validation to those people, that it's okay if you're not fully invested in your grief early on. That day will come for you.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to talking a little bit. Well, when you can find activity, do you want to have anything more you want to say about the survival? And then I thought we could move in and talk about what people can expect from MAD.
Sure. I found I always had to keep myself in pretty good physical shape, and so I was a runner, and I shortly, as soon as I could, shortly after my daughter's death, is I tried to run again, and I had a lot of tries and failures, because that takes a functioning heart and lungs and all these things. And all the parts weren't working early on. It was kind of humorous, because I would start up a hill or something, and I get hit by what we famously know as a grief spasm, and it just stopped me in my tracks. But I kept at it, and I was persistent, and that was very, very helpful for me. So physical exercise, not everybody's a runner, but some sort of exercise, walking, making sure that you're checking the sunsets, anything, outside of yourself as helps. And I found great relief, and as have many, in journaling and writing down thoughts. One of the regrets that I have is very early on in the process, it was my experience, and I'm not sure that I'm unique in this either, but I had it was as though a VCR tape had hit rewind, the old VCR tapes in my daughter's life, and they rewound and started playing.
Mm-hmm.
And I had these snapshots of this happened and that happened, and all these wonderful memories were just flooding my brain. And I treasured that, and I thought, I'm going to have this forever. This is what I have left. One of the horrible realizations I had was that tape only played once. It was a stress reaction that seemed to flow through once, and then as I got a little bit healthier, it wouldn't play like that. I still get snippets, but nothing like that big red rewind button that hit before.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's some people who can identify that are listening, because one of the things that people are so afraid of is that they're going to forget. They like it, staying connected with those memories are so important. Sometimes they don't move on,
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
It can be really difficult.
So I have another question from Terry. He said, Carl, are you still angry at your ex-wife? And if not, what do you do to get past the anger?
Very good question. No, I'm not, and I needed to dump that quick. The discussion I had with myself, my internal conversation, went something along the lines of this. It was, this is your life, this is not her life, and you have to separate the two immediately. There is no room in your life for her, not after what's happened, not ever again. And because of what has happened, this is not going to be easy, but separate that as quickly as I could. And I was successful at that I did a lot of research on forgiveness. My pastor tends to call that the F word.
Yeah.
I think that's a great description because it's such a difficult concept. Gloria, you and I have had several conversations about forgiveness.
Right.
In my case, it was internal, not external. I would never have contacted my ex-wife and said, I forgive you.
Right.
That's different than anger.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've got a question here. This woman says, Carl, do you have more children? She said, I have a problem. I have 3 children, and I have to connect with my ex-husband because of the other 2 children, and I hate him.
Yeah. Now, is this ex-husband associated with the death of the child?
Apparently, he was one driving.
Oh, my goodness.
She's divorced, and she hates him, and she's got 2 other kids.
Oh, my goodness.
Got to be really rough.
Yeah. Wow. For that's going to take sacrifice for the benefit of those other children, and put them first. That's my best advice.
Sacrifice. That's beautiful. Thank you. Well, let's move on to the next one. And unless you had something you wanted to say, Alan, I thought we could move over to Matt and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I've got one more question, and this is just, wow, I'm sitting here reading it twice. It's from Jeff, and I don't know what your comment might be on it, Carl, because I absolutely don't know what to say. The question is, my son Jeff was killed by a drunk driver. The drunk driver was my son Jeff.
Oh,
and asking about anger and just Is that something that you see when it is your child is the victim and the perpetrator? And if you see that, and what you might say to that person.
So Alan, just to clarify, are you saying that a sibling killed another sibling, or are you saying that the person that died
my
was
son Jeff was killed by a drunk driver, and the driver was my son Jeff. So Jeff was the driver, Jeff died, and this person feels like the son was the perpetrator and the victim.
Because he was driving drunk and he got in an accident and he died. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. We encounter this a lot at Mothers Against Drunk Driving. As a matter of fact, we have a very closely defined, because of necessity, description of what we term as a victim. That this gentleman or woman, I didn't quite catch that, but this person who lost her son because he was driving drunk, that person qualifies for and gets services from our organization, and we would reach out to them. Now, That's great. Lot of people in that position are very understandably reluctant to, because their son or daughter was the perpetrator of their own death, and that doesn't make any difference, because we were in the aftermath of the crash, and that person that wrote to you is certainly in the aftermath of that crash and deserves services.
Thank you for pointing that out. Thank you.
Okay, do you want to talk about the Matt and child endangerment?
Sure. One of the things that as things went from this unique position that I was in, and then the development of the public service announcement, and then the development of the documentary, they're just as an odd piece of timing in the world of traffic safety. The Centers for Disease Control came out with a result of a study in 2001 that looked at child deaths in drunk driving collisions, and shockingly found that in the last 11 years, when the study spanned 11 years, and in those 11 years of this country, 66% of the children killed in crashes were killed in cars that were driven by the drunk driver, and that these people were supposed to be the caretaker of that child. It was startling. I think everybody in this culture of it'll never happen to me also thinks, when it comes to drunk driving, that's that other guy out there. And everybody thinks that if a child is killed, then it must have been because somebody came across the center line, the driver plowed into a family, and a child was killed. Instead, it was the person at fault was behind the steering wheel of the car that the child was riding in the overwhelming number of cases. So this study came out, and then Mothers Against Drunk Driving assembled a task force, an expert panel, to look at a study and to examine the laws in the country, in the various states of the country, to see if it's being addressed correctly by law and policy, because this is wrong. And at that point, I was invited to be part of this task force. I was still a supervisor with the State Patrol in Wyoming, and we met several times as a group, and then developed a report, and turned out some very good materials for MAD to use. And we developed a whole packet, because the offices, when we polled the offices and chapters of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, there was an overwhelming number of these phone calls were coming in of people that were worried about their children or their neighbors' children or all kinds of sources reporting that these children are being endangered. Can somebody do something? What can I do? Situations not unlike mine where there was a divorce involved and custody orders issued on visitation. In my own example, the furthest I could get the courts to go was to put a restriction on both parents that neither one would consume alcohol in the presence of that child. This was predating the great availability now that we have of ignition interlock devices. And so one of the things that my organization is currently urging these family law courts is to engage in doing this solemn approach by saying, okay, if there's concern about the safety of children in this divorce or pending divorce or separation, when both parents are going to be transporting children, then both of you will have an ignition interlock device to ensure that the
ignition interlock devices turn the car on and blow into something. Is that what it is?
Yeah,
Okay.
the other way around. You have to blow first, and then the car makes a decision whether or not you're safe to drive.
Yeah, I'm thinking of not just adults doing this, but teenagers that are driving, young adults, driving siblings, all that kind of driving friends.
Right. And as a sidebar, and I won't take too much time on that, we're working on very advanced engineering, promoting this very advanced engineering that would enable all cars to decide all drivers.
Oh, wow.
Very invisibly and without anybody having to take a breath test or anything overt like that. But the car would make a decision about whether or not the driver's okay to drive.
That's incredible, Carl. That's fabulous.
Yeah, I know.
That's very exciting stuff.
My car right now, if I swerve a little bit, I'll get a beep and it'll say, move off the road, you're tired.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's move on to our next one, because I know you've got a lot of wonderful brochures and all that for people.
Yes, we do have a bunch of materials for folks that are concerned about these kinds of issues. We have a whole packet that we send them that includes the original child endangerment report and materials not only directed at the parents, the adults, but also at the children for steps that they can take to ensure their own safety if they feel that they're riding with a driver who might be impaired. Urging them, for instance, to get into the back seat of the car if they're not already in the back seat. And by now, I hope that we know that our children need to be in the back seat. To get into the middle, use safety restraints, be quiet, make sure there's nothing above them and behind them that could, if there's sudden braking involved or front end collision, that could become a missile and injure them, those kinds of things.
And let's move on to the next slide, your victim services, because I think that's going to be important for people to hear what you've got there.
Yeah, we operate a 24-hour helpline, and we receive, in this particular arena, we receive calls from victims of all kinds. And in this particular arena, like I say, we have prepared materials for folks. But we run a helpline at the number of 877 MAD HELP, and that's MAD with 2 Ds, HELP.
And we'll show that on the next slide. But, you know, I wanted to ask you something so we didn't run out of time about this. One of the things that I hear from you is that you have gone out and become proactive. You've gotten involved. You've reached out. You've moved out. And I think, you know, with Compassionate Friends, I've seen it. You know, people become chapter leaders. They join chapters. I think you have some chapters. People volunteer. My point is that this opening, moving out. Go ahead.
And they're of service.
Yes. And
yeah, very much so.
So what I would like to ask you, if I'm watching this, and yeah, I've been involved in a crash, and you know the trial is over and everything, can I volunteer at MAD?
Oh, absolutely. We have. That's exactly how our organization started, and that's how we survive. That's our base. That's our core, and that's how why we serve and how we serve right there. As people come to us, maybe we've helped them, maybe we haven't, but we have a whole track for volunteers to get involved with. In some parts of the country, it's heavier involvement than others. We'd like it a lot more standard, as I'm sure everybody's organization would be. There's some parts of the country where we have a lot of staff. There's some parts of the country where we're all volunteer driven. So we have all shapes and sizes and room for everybody.
And you know, I was interested because Heidi and I presented there, and my son was not killed by a drunk driver. He was killed in a car with somebody driving carelessly. And one of the things that impressed me was I was very accepted at MAD, you know, giving a speech, and I'm writing a monthly blog for MAD now. And I loved the way that you know, accepted a sin with, you know, that helping. You don't have to have had drunk driving in this situation.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Gloria.
And
we
the Compassionate Friends, Carl, I also want to say that, you know, we have such crossover in our organization. So many of our people have you know, are involved with MAD. And you give a great place for those that find healing and advocacy. MAD gives them that. And, of course, you guys refer so many of your bereaved families who've lost a child, a sibling, a grandchild to us. And so we certainly honor the work that you guys are doing, and how you've helped members of the Compassionate Friends and the Open to Hope audience as well. So you're a great organization, and it's an honor to refer people to you and have you refer them to us.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And that's a vital function of both organizations. And there's some cross lines right there. Because there's a back and forth referral, and that's been going on for years.
Yep, we met you at TCF. Alan, let's show the last slide, and that'll give people the number of MAD, and then why don't you close the show for us? It's been a pleasure.
Yes, well, Carl, thank you so much for all that you do, and for all that you give, all the families that you help, and thanks for informing our audience a little bit more and getting them acquainted with MAD. We just appreciate it. We thank all of you for joining us for our webinar tonight. Once again, this is brought to you by Open to Hope and the Compassionate Friends. And tonight we honor the organization MAD. And Dr. Gloria, Dr. Heidi, always a pleasure with you. Carl, once again, thank you. And we thank everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carl and Alan.
Thank you, everybody. It's been an honor.
Good night.
Good night.
Oh. TMA's on the homepage of Rolling Home.
Oh, how cute.
Cute picture.
Oh, that's darling.
Excellent, everybody.
I can stay.
Hey, Alan, it was fun.
It was fun.
Anyone who's on can still hear.
Thank you, everybody who's on.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. That was great. Good night, everybody.